We've got yet again another problem where we're asked to solve by completing the square. Now, in the previous example, the quadratic had an x squared coefficient of 1. And we don't have that in this case. We actually have a coefficient of 4. And that kind of makes things a little bit messy for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this coefficient equal to 1. Well, how do we go about doing that? Okay, well, let's think very carefully. How would I make a 4? How would I turn that into a 1? Well, I'd have to divide everything by 4. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Divide by 4, divide by 4, and divide by 4. Okay, so that's going to give me something that looks along the lines of this. X squared minus 7/4 of x. All right, I'm going to leave a space equals 1/4. Okay, why did I leave a space? Well, remember that I'm going to have to take half of the b coefficient. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to take half of the b coefficient, which is negative 7/4. I'm going to actually multiply it by 1/2, which would be the same as dividing it by 2, and I'm going to square it. So let's go ahead and do the same operation to this side. Okay, so what is this right here? This happens to be negative 7/8. So I'm going to write x squared minus 7/4 of x plus negative 7/8 square. And this right here was negative 7/8, if you recall. So I'm going to just square it right now while I've got the chance. And let's see what we get. Well, negative 7 squared is 49, and 8 squared is 64. Okay, so don't sweat this. We're almost done with this problem. We're going to do our trick here. All right, we've got our binomial squared right here. We've got x, and then we've got minus 7/8. And we're going to square it. Now this part you might think is the tricky part because you probably haven't added fractions in quite some time. But we're going to do it anyway. Common denominator is really quick. It's just 64. So what do I need to do? Multiply this by 16 and this by 16, because that will give me 16 out of 16, which is 1. 16 times 1 is 16. 16 times 4 is 64. So we end up with 16 plus 49, which is 65 out of 64, right? Okay, so 65 out of 64. Nothing to worry about, because now we're at a point where we can apply the square root property. Okay, so let's apply that famous square root property. We've got x minus 7/8 in this case, and we're going to set it equal to, now 65 is by no means a perfect square. Okay, so I know it's not perfect. I know it's not perfect at all. So I'm just going to leave it as plus and minus the square root of 65. But what's the square root of 64? That right there is a perfect square, and it's 8. All right, now I can move this guy to the other side. I'm going to add 7/8. Add 7/8. All right. And now I end up with something that looks like this. X equals it equals 7 plus and minus the square root of 65, all divided by 8, because guess what? They are common denominators. So x equals 7 plus and minus the square root of 65 over 8. This is our answer to this quadratic equation. And if you're familiar with quadratic equations, which if you've reached this class, college algebra, then you're familiar if you've taken algebra 2. This looks a lot like one of those answers we got when we solved a quadratic using the quadratic formula. So this is a completing the square problem, but it's a nice segue into what's coming next, which is solving a quadratic using the quadratic formula.